Okay, so the white knight of the far right has been unceremoniously booted out the door. You're cheering, and rightly so, but don't go celebrating too soon. Because when you look at Roger Ailes, the icy political and economic forces that created him, and are even now backing him up, you realize this is just par for the course for him. A fact of power is that it regularly rearranges itself. For those who know how to play the game, there's no such thing as being sidelined. For those in the know, you merely take a lower profile, that's all. Roger Eugene Ailes has been shaping and reshaping the American political landscape of media far longer than you may realize. While he hadn't always been politically active, he has always been politically aware. Although he may not have been old enough to vote in 1960, Ailes was certainly an observer of American politics. He saw Richard Nixon debate John Kennedy in 1960, and while on paper Nixon held his own, if not narrowly made the better case, the truth was, when one watched that broadcast, you saw a pale, sweaty, seemingly nervous Richard Nixon, contrasting sharply with the tanned and not sweaty at all Senator Kennedy. That debate is credited with being the defining moment of the 1960 election. The GOP simply didn't have an answer for this new medium. It's one thing for Eisenhower to run TV ads, especially when the Democrats were running none, but in a face-to-face confrontation, the Democrats had the Republicans cold. Republicans were so traumatized by how devastating the impact of television had been with that debate that it would be another 15 years before they dared to allow another Republican to take part in a presidential debate. Richard Nixon ran off to lick his wounds for a few years, but getting back to the White House was never far from his mind. He didn't think much of television, seeing it more as a gimmick in political terms. I guess that was his way of rationalizing that he was too inept to take advantage of the new medium. Nixon went on a popular variety show called The Mike Douglas Show. The other guest that evening was a belly dancer called Little Egypt and her pet boa constrictor. But there was another snake in the studio that evening, one far more dangerous. Roger Eugene Ailes, who at the time was a 27-year-old producer on The Mike Douglas Show. He saw the washed-up Republican and felt that maybe befriending Nixon would be a way to get himself out of the broadcast sideshow he was stuck in. He offered his services to help Nixon use television to his own advantage, instead of always being a victim of it. Nixon accepted. Now, to hear liberals tell it, you may think that Roger Ailes kissed the ground that Nixon walked on. Not at all. First of all, Ailes as well as Nixon were con men, and as I've always told you, there's no honor among thieves. Secondly, for men like Ailes who play the game of power politics, it doesn't pay to get too hung up on relationships. They all come to an end sooner or later. Ailes clearly understood that this was business, not personal. His job was image crafting, and to teach an antiquated loser how to win. It's not necessary that a consultant know his client personally or even like him. Ailes certainly didn't have the highest opinion of Richard Nixon at the time. He was quoted as having said about Nixon, "Let's face it, a lot of people think Nixon is dull, a bore, a pain in the ass. Now you put him on television and you've got a problem right away. He's a funny-looking guy. He looks like somebody hung him in a closet overnight and he jumps out in the morning with his suit all bunched up and starts running around saying, 'I want to be president.' I mean, this is how he strikes some people." Yeah, people like Ailes. Ailes knew that Nixon would never be likable. He struck people as a cheap shyster because that's what he was, a career lawyer who made it his business to be an attack dog in the courtroom. But the same quality that made Nixon so effective at law made him unelectable to the public. Ailes saw it as his first mission to make Nixon palatable to the masses. They didn't have to love Nixon, but they did have to be able to stand a look at him. Ailes knew that putting Nixon into a debate situation with a Democrat was suicide. He was no better at debating in 1967 than he had been when Kennedy trounced him 7 years earlier. So, instead, Ailes chose to pioneer the kind of phony stage presentation that would become a staple of Fox News. He put together a series of 1-hour pre-taped studio appearances in front of a live audience. Live, but not random. The people in the audience were all meticulously chosen by the GOP and filtered by Ailes himself. It was a TV show whose entire theme was to demonstrate that people liked Nixon, and they connected with him. The audience would smile at his corny jokes and applaud on cue, and the people at home would hopefully be influenced to think that, hey, that Nixon guy, he ain't so bad after all. In media terms, this is the equivalent of letting a crook get away with murder. Want to know why Sean Hannity never has a real debate on his show? Why every time that they have somebody on, they make certain to front-load the panel with 2 or even 3 people to counter them? Because that's the whole point. Sure, Nixon got a few hard questions, but mostly they were softballs from plants in the audience. And the one time that a radio talk show host in the audience tried to corner Nixon on his refusal to go on a real show like Meet the Press instead of confining his appearances to big studio events, Nixon gave a weak dodge which the audience on cue applauded him for. This is classic Ailes. He understands and has always understood that you can shape the public's perception of events live as it happens, so that a clear loss can be spun as a win. Sure, many at home would marvel at how stupid the audience was for applauding Nixon for no reason, but they would also think right-wing tools must have some appeal or support from the public, when in truth, they don't. Unless you think that Ailes was neutral on the issue of black people, here's a little tidbit for you. According to Joe McGinnis, a longtime friend of Roger Ailes, he wrote a book about Nixon's second presidential campaign called The Selling of the President in 1968. McGinnis said that when putting together one of his staged studio appearances for Nixon, Roger Ailes was going over the list of people who would be in the studio audience. White moderate voters in the North, in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia, which have significant black populations, would not like seeing a lily white audience. This would be a problem for Ailes, considering that he and Nixon were pursuing a Southern strategy and wanted to make it clear to white Southern voters that Nixon couldn't tolerate blacks any more than the good old boys down South could. Ailes said, "We definitely need a Negro. I don't think it's necessary to have one in every group of 6 people, no matter what our ethnic experts say, but in Philadelphia it is. U.S. News & World Report says this week that 1 in every 3 voters in Philadelphia will be a Negro, and god damn it, we're locked into this thing anyway. Once you start, it's hard as hell to stop, because the press will pick it up and make a big deal out of, why no Negro all of a sudden?" Allegedly, one of Ailes' staffers suggested a safe Negro that he knew of, saying that this token Negro wasn't a light-skinned black, so it would be readily apparent he was a person of color without Nixon having to awkwardly point it out. Ailes reportedly replied, "You mean we don't have to put a sign around him that says, 'This is our Negro'? Fine, call him. Let's get this thing going." And this has been the visual format for every Republican political rally and convention ever since. They understand fully that they've branded themselves as the white man's party, and they don't want more than 1 or 2 blacks in the room, and it's not because they wanted to deflect the charge of racism. The Republicans know that people see through their scam, and that's the whole idea. It gets it across the white voters that the Republican candidate only tolerates black people, but Republican candidates certainly don't like black people. This is the kind of unspoken understanding that white supremacy relies upon. When it comes to media, a picture truly does speak 1,000 words. Now you're beginning to understand where so much visual shorthand for the GOP originated. Ailes may not have thought it all up, but he was definitely the one most responsible for organizing it all. Nixon won the presidency in '68, and Roger Ailes moved on to the White House as Nixon's media advisor. He created not 1 but 2 media companies, REA Productions and Ailes Communications, Inc. But even before the 1972 re-election, Ailes was already trying to figure out how to get himself back into TV, and this time he attempted to take the entire GOP with him, literally. Now, ordinarily, I'd never quote Gawker, but they were the ones who broke the story, so I gotta have to. Gawker had gone through the Nixon Library archives and found a 15-page memo from around the summer of 1970 in a cache of documents belonging to Nixon's former Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, the first presidential Chief of Staff to ever do time. The memo detailed plans for a Republican television station, all GOP all the time. It's unknown who exactly typed the document up, but each page is covered with hand-scrawled notes written by Roger Ailes himself. It detailed their murderous cunning to destroy all dissent, to use any means to monopolize the airwaves, and their sheer contempt for the people who watch what they produce. As an example, one part of the memo reads, "Today, television news is watched more often than any other form of communication. The reason? People are lazy. With television, you just sit, watch, listen. The thinking is done for you." This was blatant political propaganda. Here's how it would have worked. They would take a Republican congressman or senator, videotape an interview with them in the morning, then edit the footage on a custom-made news truck en route to the national airport where they would fly it to the lawmaker's home district in time for the evening news. Keep in mind, this is in the days before satellite TV, so that's the way the footage had to be shipped. This is no different than what the mainstream news do today, except they don't limit their coverage only to one political party. With fiendish glee, these conspirators identify the top media markets that they want to target with their propaganda. And this wasn't just idle talk. They went so far as to plan out a startup and annual operating budget, estimated at the time to be $375,000 minimum to start, and less than that to run annually. All this in 1970, mind you, long before the Watergate scandal. There was no pressing need per se for a Republican-controlled media outlet, but Ailes figured, why wait? He even went so far as to suggest that the idea should be expanded to include members of the Nixon administration, such as the cabinet. Now, this was the very GOP who daily condemned the Soviets for their state-run TV, who excoriated the left for anything that even smelled remotely of centralized government control. Yet here they were, coldly plotting how to have the White House itself run their very own propaganda network, meant to imitate the trappings of legitimate news, all the while being a clumsy front for the Republican Party. And just in case the Nixon White House wasn't certain who ought to run their propaganda network, Ailes knew just the guy. Roger Ailes personally sent a memo to Bob Haldeman telling him that he wanted to bid for the project on a provisional basis with no commitment. Of course, what went unsaid is that this was a de facto government contract which Ailes' media company would charge through the nose for. Well, apparently his sales pitch worked because records show that Ailes did indeed get the job of setting up and running the proposed GOP network, and Nixon's chief of staff himself came up with the name, Capitol News Service. The proposed GOP network failed to materialize, but Ailes' dream of establishing a Republican-controlled media apparatus was just being born, and his first opportunity to run exactly that type of operation was only a couple of years away. Drinking beer is a dirty habit, which is why I don't do it. It's even filthier when you consider who it is who makes the beer you drink and what these men stand for. Joseph Coors was one of the heirs to the Coors Brewing Company dynasty. He was also a rabid, anti-black racist and right-winger. Now here's where black people need to listen closely and understand how power operates in the real world and why you're never going to get anywhere unless you get into the habit of putting money behind the things you believe in. Joseph Coors was known for his far-right ideology, but he was also known as being a big contributor to many right-wing causes, like the Christian Broadcast Network, and he used his money to found several right-wing think tanks, including the Hoover Institution, the Manhattan Institute, the Free Congress Foundation, and most damningly of all, the so-called Heritage Foundation. And if these names all sound like cheap covers for white supremacist race pride organizations, there's a reason for that. Because Joseph Coors was also a big financial contributor to the John Birch Society, one of the most notoriously anti-black and anti-Semitic organizations in U.S. history. Let this be a lesson to black people about why white supremacists are in power. Rich white supremacists don't just stack up their money and then go back to the beach. They start looking for ways to secure their power, and that means societal control. That's what think tanks do. They concoct schemes about how to manipulate and control the public. That's why they're often called public policy organizations. The Koch brothers used their billion-dollar fortunes to fund organizations such as Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Institute, the Federalist Society, and the American Enterprise Institute, among many others. But the Koch brothers' biggest contribution to public policy has been their political action committee, Citizens United, who successfully spearheaded the Supreme Court ruling that allowed billionaires to use their money to influence elections without limit. This is how white supremacists use their money. The Bible says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But white supremacists seem to have a more pragmatic view. Wheresoever their power is, that's where they put their treasure. Anyway, back to Joseph Coors. Old Joe was tired of what he saw as the liberal bias of the mainstream media, and he was angry at the media's recent decision to start portraying black people somewhat sympathetically. He was actively looking for conservative organizations and projects to support. I want to repeat that because that's crucial to understand. Joseph Coors was actively looking for conservative organizations and projects that he could funnel money to. As Jason and I have always told you, when white people are angry about something, they start looking around for someone to write a check to. In 1973, a conservative investment banker from Boston named Robert Pauley had his own idea for a conservative news network, calling it TVN, Television News. Their target audience would have been the vast number of local independent networks, TV stations not affiliated with any of the big three networks. TVN would produce video packages and then distribute them to these independent local networks who wanted to subscribe to their service, just like Ailes and Haldeman's proposed Capitol News Service a couple of years earlier. Roger Coors immediately decided that he loved Pauley's idea for a right-wing network and pledged $1 million in startup capital with a commitment for another $2.5 million for annual operating expenses. They came out of the gate giving many of the same rhetorical talking points that would become so well known on Fox News 20 years later, saying that TVN would merely present the facts to the public and allow the people to make up their own minds as to what to believe. We report, you decide, anyone? The guy who Joseph Coors chose to run his propaganda mill was Jack Wilson, one of the co-founders of the Heritage Foundation. And to give you an idea of the kind of ship that Jack Wilson ran, here's a memo Jack Wilson wrote to Joseph Coors on July 26, 1973, entitled Critique of Daily Newsfeed. Keep in mind, this is a memo written by a man allegedly running a news network, a man who constantly bragged that he and his news organization were unbiased. Martin Luther King was an avowed communist revolutionary. It is not necessary for us to cover him or any of his subordinates just because the other networks do so. We are going to be different. If we are going to be the same, then we are going to continue to cover all the communist stories and carry all of their lines. There you have it. As Joseph Coors and his pals saw it, television was the front line in the war on communism. And clearly, as far as they were concerned, communist meant black. Here's another memo Jack Wilson wrote, dated June 20th, 1973. He was angry that his reporters dared to report on the Russian Prime Minister as being the Soviet leader. His explanation for his anger is quite telling. Quote, by referring to Soviet Premier Brezhnev as the Soviet leader, we put the man in the same category as Nixon. Brezhnev is not elected, but our president is. Brezhnev is a party boss and should be so identified. Well, so much for letting the public make up their own minds, huh? The memo continues, with all the media doing the same thing, we gradually break down the barrier and create a climate of equality between the Russian and American systems. The end result is that they are upgraded and we are downgraded, and everyone is equal. If this sounds exactly like the racialist code speak that the right wing uses on radio and TV, that's because it is. This is pure political ideology. 20 years before Fox News, in fact over a decade before the emergence of right-wing radio. These guys didn't even make a pretense that they were about journalism. It's all right-wing dogma. However, I think Jack Wilson's July 5th, 1973 memo puts the proper point on his kvetching. On that date, David Rockefeller of the Chase banking empire had run afoul of Wilson by going to both the Soviet Union and Communist China for the sake of drumming up business for the Chase Bank. The Chinese allowed Chase to become their first correspondent bank. That means Chase provided services on behalf of the client banks, such as wire transfers and acceptance of deposits, all for a nominal fee, of course. Now, whatever you may think of Chinese policies, you can't deny that what David Rockefeller was doing was just pure capitalism. Yes, it's odious, but as Thomas Jefferson said, the merchant knows no loyalty to any country. But Jack Wilson apparently felt capitalist expansion ought to stop at China's shores. Quote, David Rockefeller, nothing like this should ever be allowed on our air. Rockefeller took a communist public relations tour the same way Ramsey Clark did in Hanoi when he reported our prisoners were all well-fed, healthy, happy men. We are not providing this service to give voice to that kind of propaganda. But even this hard-right proselytizing wasn't enough. By 1974, it was clear the people Joseph Coors and Jack Wilson had hired to staff TVN didn't understand the kind of fair and balanced journalism Coors and Wilson were trying to establish. So, Jack Wilson fired many of the top executives at TVN and brought in one of their consultants to be the new news director, Roger Ailes. Ailes had no background whatsoever in reporting news, but for TVN this was a good thing. As one TVN staffer at the time put it, the Coors people trust Ailes because he's not a newsman. They don't trust newsmen. But even Roger Ailes couldn't overcome the fact that TVN was costing Coors too much money and wasn't bringing in enough money. The stampede of right-wing TV stations looking to buy their products simply never materialized. In October 1975, TVN signed off for the last time. Roger Ailes went back to political consulting for the GOP, not that he ever stopped. He coached Ronald Reagan in 1984 to beat Walter Mondale in their presidential debate. Ailes also aided George H.W. Bush's first presidential bid. Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater came up with the infamous Willie Horton ad. Ailes would spend the rest of his days trying to live that down, though not trying very hard. Ailes then went on to work for CNBC as a consultant and on-again, off-again producer. Eventually, some of the NBC executives wanted to establish a new network with an emphasis on a talk programming format. They called it America's Talking, and Roger Ailes seemed a natural fit to run it. Its programming slate reads like the format for Fox News, though without the ardently right-wing bent. Ailes signed off on many of the shows for the new network, including Politics with Chris Matthews, which was later moved to MSNBC and renamed Hardball with Chris Matthews. And while Roger Ailes is always the first one to vilify media people for their ties to the Democrats, such as George Stephanopoulos of ABC, Ailes had no problem with Sean Hannity, who's been a frequent contributor to the GOP candidates and is even now said to be low-key advising the Trump campaign. But then again, Roger Ailes was an advisor to Steve Forbes' failed presidential run in the 90s, and he objected when the NBC brass saw that as a conflict of interest on his part. Ailes was credited with helping to nearly double CNBC's revenues, but lack of control over the TV product, the loss of America's talking to the newly started MSNBC, and discontent with his fellow executives brought him to the point where he wanted out. It was once again time for Ailes to go looking for a white supremacist who was tired of what he was seeing and was looking to write a check. He found the billionaire media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch knew that using the talk radio format for TV would be a big risk, even if he was bankrolling the project himself. Normally, cable TV providers pay networks for the right to broadcast their content. Murdoch fully understood that the cable news sandbox was full of competition, and it would be difficult and time-consuming to establish Fox, even with its rapidly right-leaning format. So Murdoch decided to pay the cable TV providers $10 per subscriber to carry his fledgling station. This was unprecedented. It was also a deal the providers couldn't resist. Granted, the providers would have to pay licensing fees later on, but from the outset, Murdoch was buying cable TV provider support. And it worked. There was nothing the upstart Fox News could do or say that would induce a cable provider to drop them. And it didn't matter how many people were actually watching Fox. Murdoch's plan was to buy time for his little propaganda tool to establish itself, which it did. Roger's tenure at Fox News is well known and doesn't need repeating here. He hired Bush family cronies who helped pervert the 2000 election. He staffed his on-air talent with veteran Republican operatives such as Tony Snow, who was a former speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. He established a new standard for cable news. In the gutter. When it first went on the air, Fox's primary demo was white males between the ages of 45 and 60. Today, their average viewer is in their 60s. That means their audience is rabidly loyal, but also not getting any younger. The white males who love Fox News aren't looking for news at all. What they're looking for is news entertainment. The same way that people who watch professional wrestling aren't looking for combat sports, they're looking for sports entertainment. The Fox News viewer wants an imitation of news that tells them what they want to hear. Ailes fully understood that. There are people in America who hate reality and are always looking for an escape from it, and he provided that, and has continued to provide it daily. This is why Fox News introduced the Thigh Cam, which became the first TV news outlet that had tables allowing you to see the spokesmodel's legs. And with female anchors who are always seated at the end of the tables, wearing high-cut skirts that allow you to see their legs. Fox isn't news, and their viewers are not intelligent either. Roger Ailes has been ostensibly pushed out of the News Corp amidst a massive sexual harassment scandal, but he got a $40 million severance package, and if anything, he's only out on paper. Does anyone doubt that he's going to have some dummy front company consulting for Fox behind the scenes? However, if you think you've heard the end of Roger Ailes, I wouldn't bet on it, for two reasons. The first, these days Ailes is consulting for Donald Trump. As I told you in my other videos and my joint broadcast, Fox News has been perpetrating a fraud against the public. Fox is the mouthpiece for the Republican Party, which means the Republican Party establishment, so there's no way they could ever endorse Trump. So Ailes decided not to. He used reverse psychology, and it worked. Fox would pretend to be against Trump, solidifying his image as the ultimate political outsider. So fringe even Fox News couldn't approve of him. Meanwhile, they were carefully guiding him in the right direction from behind the scenes, and hopefully creating a wave of populist outrage against Hillary strong enough to sweep the Don into the White House. Ailes consulting for Trump puts the lie to the idea that Fox News and their ilk were ever against him. And the second reason that Roger Ailes isn't going away doesn't really have much to do with him personally. Rather, it's because he's given rise to a pathetic host of wannabes, both in broadcast media and, most importantly, online. The white supremacist acolytes who he's inspired, like Andrew Breitbart and Matt Drudge, have been spewing hate and lies for years now. These clowns and their fellow travelers aren't going away anytime real soon. That is, unless the good guys, that's you and me, organize ourselves and organize our economy to fight them. This is where you come in. Roger Ailes is a liar, a con man, a sexist, and a mouth-frothing racist. But he's also a political realist. He searches for someone who wants a particular change in the society and is willing to pay for it, and he achieves results. Intelligent black society ought to do the same. Now, we would need tens of millions simply to get started under a conventional circumstance. Hell, even in the 1970s, Joseph Coors had to give millions to get TVN off the ground in 1970s dollars just for them to get started. And years before that, the proposed Capital News Service estimated they'd need $300,000 alone just to get off the ground, with an equivalent amount annually. It took nearly 30 years for Roger Ailes' sick ambition of establishing a Republican-controlled TV channel to become a reality. But it has, with devastating results. It seems black people are hoping that some black version of Fox will come along, no doubt funded and staffed by well-to-do people with our interest in mind. But that's simply unrealistic, because to do that would require people who are benefiting from the current status quo to use their money to fight it, and that is not in their interest. To fight the Roger Ailes will require a committed effort from you and me. If you don't put your money behind the fight against white supremacy, then the white supremacists will win, and they don't want slaves this time. They want us gone. The failure of TVN was largely due to an enthusiasm gap. Sure, conservatives needed their own media outlet, but they had not yet politically matured to the point where they wanted it. So the birth of right-wing media was stopped dead for a generation. And don't think there's many nights that Roger Ailes hadn't wondered to himself how much further along his plans for a permanent Republican majority might have been if they'd been able to make right-wing TV a reality back in the 70s. This is exactly the fix that black America is in right now. Millions of black people have seen my work. Problem is, they consider it nothing more than politically oriented entertainment. I don't, and you better not either. The white media is howling for our blood, and the white race soldiers are giving it to them, and black people are trying to hide behind entertainment, gossip, and sports in the hope that a final solution to the Negro question won't happen here. Most of our people are politically immature, and that will be the death of them. But it doesn't have to be the death of you. Do your part for the war against white supremacy. Nobody's going to do it for you, and it is your responsibility and duty to contribute to the fight. We will not let Roger Ailes or his ideological bastard children have the last word. The bad guys understand the value of funding what's in their interest. There's a lesson to be learned from the story of Roger Ailes, and it's this: that wherever your power is, you had better make sure that's where your treasure is as well. Good evening, and be one.